Single responsibility principle is one of those acronyms that's actually useful if you want to be a good software developer and really get a grip on the iOS SDK and make great Swift code. Basically, do one thing and do it well. To make that more concrete, we should say a particular class should only do one thing. There should only ever be one reason to change a certain class. And we know that many Swift programmers attempted to overload too many responsibilities onto their Vue controllers, making them responsible for, say, displaying data, downloading it, caching, animating, navigation. It just goes on and on and on. Some put the blame squarely onto the MVC architecture pattern, and let's take a look at that. MVC separates the view from the model and the controller. As we can see, the controller manipulates the model, which then updates the view. Some might say, as this is implemented on iOS platforms, we commonly conflate the view and the controller into the view controller. Sometimes even going further, putting the model in the view controller, which is far from a single responsibility. Many implementations don't really bind the controller and the model how might be expected, which ideally would be use of KVO or bindings, which further muddies the waters. Which is to say, in the abstract, there are many developers who aren't getting their code to conform to the single responsibility principle, and worse, they're muddying the waters with how they're developing their MVC product. As a concrete example, we can think about where we might place the data with a table view implemented in a given view controller. Now the following is certainly a trivial example, and I've got a load more in the description so it can be downloaded from GitHub and real understanding can take place through examples, but this is meant to be a simple example of the single responsibility principle and how you might think about architecting and structuring your code. I've created this rather simple app that displays a list. In fact, both of these buttons have pretty much the same functionality, but under the hood, something different's going on in terms of the code. So here we have, well, I'd say a typical view controller. Although the UI table view data source has been placed in an extension, I don't think that's avoiding this idea of the single responsibility principle. So we have the view controller doing, well, too much. It is displaying the data to the user and it's formatting the data for the table source. We can do better. Instead, we can separate out a data source class. This is displayed in the same file just to make it easier to read on the screen. So in some sense, this is called better, but why? It's this idea of moving away from the view controller class, but it's more than just that. It's creating a reusable class that can be used for perhaps multiple view controllers. And our data source is potentially testable separately from the view controller. The idea is your code becomes easier to maintain, test, and even easier to write if you're properly maintaining the single responsibility principle and think about why you're putting your code where you are. That principle is the idea that a class should only do one thing and there should only be a single reason to change. Having the data nested inside your view controller class sounds from that perspective like a mistake. And this is all about doing better. It's easy to get hung up on which architecture to use. In some domains it's easy to talk about which programming language you use up until the point where you're not getting any work done. But the single responsibility principle is actually worth thinking about because it's always worth making maintainable, easy to read code that's testable and does what it's meant to do. Having code that you can't maintain, that you can't use in the future, is a mistake everyone's made. And yet, if we just think a bit deeply, think about principles like the single responsibility principle, perhaps we can do better. I hope this video has been of use to you. Maybe I'll see you next time.